No, that's taking too long. Okay, that was a little more involved than the AKS-74U video, so if you're confused, let's drop the silent ASMR build gimmick and talk through the project. And to be clear, for the genius level intellects who previously watched me hacksaw barrel in half, 3D print and friction fit a piston head, install an inner barrel and hop unit, and somehow didn't realize until the test fire that it was an airsoft gun in that airsoft video on this airsoft channel, yeah, this one's airsoft too, go figure. Welcome to Explosive Enterprises, and the ZM Weapons LR-300 has been an obscure object of desire for me ever since playing Stalker Shadow of Chernobyl way back in 2007. It's by far the most popular piece of media to depict the LR-300, and in fact the LR-300 is the only AR variant to appear in the original trilogy, playing into their juxtaposition of near-future technology against post-apocalyptic atmosphere. At the time, this was the AR of the future, and on paper it had a lot going for it. Most obviously, it relocates the recoil spring forwards, but it also uses an extended gas key to delay the gas impulse in a similar manner to long-stroke piston guns, while still using Stoner's short-stroke internal gas piston. Aesthetically, it represents the very narrow window between the adoption of Picatinny rails and the subsequent dark times of putting heavy quad rails on absolutely everything. It's cool, it's different, it's featured in a game I like, and it has never existed as a proper gas blowback replica. This build is a DIY hodgepodge hybrid of a G&G LR-300, a VFC Olympic Arms AR, aftermarket internals, some real steel parts, some commercially printed parts, and a couple of purely homemade elements. Before we jump into the build, I want to mention that if you'd like to support our channel, we now have a Patreon. We're also now posting text content there, which is available both to patrons and non-patrons, so if you're interested in more technical detail beyond the scope of our videos, consider checking out the link in the description. Starting with the externals, the barrel is a Crusader steel pencil profile 11.5 inch intended for use with VFCs. Because this uses real steel 1/2 by 28 right-handed threading, the muzzle device is neither the 14mm flash hider that came with the G&G nor the one that came with the VFC, it's a Yankee Hill Machining Phantom flash hider. The real LR-300 used a non-standard barrel profile, so I 3D printed a sleeve to bulk it out to the right diameter to use a G&G gas block. The lower section, however, is a tri-rail designed by Gordon 29170 and contracted out to Xometry to print in nylon PA12 via multijet fusion. The gas block has a dovetail for the front sight. It currently has a real steel Blitzkrieg Components luminous front sight installed, which just required running a M4 die along the threads to resize slightly. The gas block also has a retention mechanism for the top cover, so let's go ahead and remove that now. You can see that I've substantially altered this top cover, as now it both needs to provide clearance for the recoil assembly and actually has to be removable to field strip the gun. Underneath is the op rod, made from 5mm steel rod and extending forwards from the bolt carrier. It goes all the way up to a slot cut in the front handguard retainer just to get maximum space for the recoil spring. By pulling back on the spring, I can remove the retainer, which is a simple piece I designed and 3D printed that is held in place by the edges of flat cuts on the sides of the op rod. That disengages the recoil system to permit disassembly, which also reveals the grub screw securing the gas block to the barrel, but for now I'll put it back. The spring was an off-the-shelf part from McMaster-Carr, and you can see how it functions with the retainer compressing the spring against the receiver. At the rear, the spring is sandwiched between the body of the G&G rear handguard retainer and a 3D printed support piece I added. All these furniture components are off the G&G, obviously with some modification, but the barrel nut is actually an original LR-300 part I happened to find secondhand. In fact, it is the only part on this build to actually come from the real LR-300. Now the receivers, the upper was originally a real steel Ultor modular upper receiver. I chose this upper because it has a bit of a futuristic look that deviates from mil-spec, and because the forward assist is placed closer to the ejection port, much like on the LR-300. In addition to altering it to fit the VFC lower and grinding off the deflector to better resemble the LR-300, I also made the difficult decision to grind off the Picatinny rail and bolt on a project rail to raise it. This project rail was originally intended for converting fixed carry handle uppers to flat tops, so it had roughly the right profile, and this raised the carry handle to match the taller profile of the LR-300 upper. Subsequent to completing this project, I learned that a VFC HK416 upper is actually exactly the right height. Should I have opted for that instead? Well, it would have been a lot easier, but I still like this deflector more, so I'm gonna cope and say I made the right call. Well, I left the gas tube position alone, and this is why the recoil system is a little different from the real thing, though of course none of that is visible once the top cover is in place. The lower receivers, the VFC Olympic arms. I consider getting a blank lower, but the real LR-300 is primarily sold as an upper and furniture package intended for use with existing lowers. Olympic Arms was one of the more popular AR brands in the 90s and early aughts, so this actually fits pretty well. The pistol grip is another 3D printed design, this time by Quorm Makes, again contracted out to Xometry. Then the stock is the G&G with the end plate slightly modified to fit on the VFC lower. It attaches using the original stock screw, but rather than thread into a gearbox, it now threads into a Titan tactical buffer tube plug, which I selected specifically because it has a 5mm threaded hole in the middle, which happens to correspond to the original screw. To disassemble, I just have to remove the recoil spring retainer, and then the bolt carrier comes out like any other AR. This is a Crusader steel carrier, chopped in half, replacing the ESD carrier shown in the montage, which broke its nozzle guide. This modified Crusader comes in at just 175 grams and has no buffer, so this is only a bit over half as much recoiling mass as a stock VFC AR. It's snappy in cycling, but doesn't have a ton of recoil, and that is unfortunately unavoidable with this kind of setup. At the end of its travel, it strikes a piece of rubber sheet glued to the buffer tube plug to dampen the impact. Because there's no longer a surface on the bolt carrier to trip the auto sear, I had to do some pretty significant work to make full auto function. This consisted of a 3D printed insert for the bolt carrier to add a pair of hooks protruding out the bottom, and a corresponding trip that drops into the lower receiver. When the carrier comes forwards, the hooks on the carrier strike the hooks on the trip, which pulls the auto sear forwards. This is totally different from the real LR-300, which used an extra pin in the lower for some kind of linkage, but I couldn't figure out exactly how it worked. I strongly suspect the depiction in all those World of Guns animations is bogus, as it doesn't match what's in the LR-300 manual, and it just doesn't really make sense on the face of it. This alternative implementation works and has the added benefit of requiring no alteration to the lower. And yes, this project would have all been massively easier had I just used a Maple Leaf Hummingbird carrier, which does not require a buffer tube and contains its own recoil spring and auto sear trip, but that seemed much less interesting than doing it, well, maybe not properly, but a little closer. I also made substantial changes to the nozzle and hop setup, but those are going to be the focus of their own video because they're applicable to more normal ARs too. So let's talk ergonomics. And no, I don't know for certain why the rear sight is at the front of the receiver. That's how it's done in most of the ZM weapons marketing, and I've heard two possible explanations. The first is that it's meant to make it easier to acquire at short range at the cost of shortening the sight radius, which a lot of people seem to find unconvincing, but we'll get to that in a moment. The second explanation is that it's to accommodate a short eye relief magnified optic, but it does not explain why they would retain this niche arrangement for irons-only setups or with red dots where there is no eye relief to worry about. I suspect this may be one of those things where there's no objectively correct answer, but people have irrationally strong opinions anyways, like the guys already writing comments because I said niche instead of niche again. That said, having given this odd sight placement a fair shake, I think there's some merit to the first explanation. The narrow aperture is essentially unusable, but the larger A2 CQB aperture now functions like a shotgun ghost ring sight. Pushing it farther from the eye makes it more visible and easier to align on while focusing the target, and also makes it appear more narrow so that it's sort of in between the apparent size of the two different apertures when in the more conventional placement. All straightforward enough, but what surprised me is how the apparent width of the aperture and the apparent width of the front sight wings are now the same, and this does genuinely help with aligning the sights quickly. Despite the reduced sight radius, I find that for the short ranges of Airsoft this actually works pretty well, which I guess shouldn't be surprising. After all, this is the work of Alan Zita, a multiple-time IPSC and IDPA champion in addition to gunsmith, the sort of dude who builds his own equipment to better compete and then actually wins with it. But while this setup works surprisingly well at 50 yards, I would definitely prefer a more conventional arrangement at 100 yards, let alone 300.
Where's that coming from?
Mason is in the spools far left. Oh shit, I got him? What the fuck?
Nice.
And for that reason, it makes sense that this sight placement didn't really catch on. In any case, these irons are standard AR height, but the rail being almost a quarter inch taller than on a standard flat top elevates them to a noticeable degree. The first generation of LR-300s actually came with shorter irons to maintain standard AR height over bore, but for the second generation, ZM changed the rear sight to a standard AR height, so the taller receiver elevates the sight plane. I like this height quite a bit. It's not tall enough to force a chin weld, but it's a little more comfortable to acquire with a heads-up posture, and that further improves the usability of the sight setup. I do generally prefer optics though, so I took my Sotac Seymour and used a half-inch QD riser to get it just above the irons. The Seymour is era appropriate for the gun, being another product of the early 2000s, and I think its lightweight suits the compactness and portability of the LR-300. It works well, but to be honest, the stock iron's good enough that I don't find an optic strictly necessary, and I have been finding that the recoil is at least sharp enough to affect the zero on this cheap copy. Well, without an optic and with the stock folded, the LR-300 is pretty small. This is the second generation of stock and has the same lengths fully collapsed and fully extended as M4 waffle stocks. I find that 1 or 2 clicks out from fully collapsed is pretty comfortable squared up. The stock can be folded while at any length and unfolds by just pulling on it. When it locks up tightly without any wobble at all. This is an excellent stock design that was way ahead of its time. I also have the first generation stock, which is the less popular but I think a little more distinctive Galil or FNC style wire folder. It's fixed to A1 length, which is perfectly fine, but it doesn't have any discernible advantages over the later collapsible design besides maybe being just a bit lighter. Frankly, I only got it because it was cheap and I like having all the options. Though if I combine the skeleton stock with removing the front tri-rail, removing the rear sight back, installing an A1 pistol grip, and attaching a suppressor, I feel like this is familiar somehow, though I can't quite place it. Has the memory gone? Are you feeling numb? As for the rest of the furniture, the forend has a solid knurled texture that provides a better grip than AR carbine handguards. The pistol grip is the most divisive aspect of this gun, but I can see what it's going for. The odd fin on the back forces the palm upwards, helping support a high grip. It's notable that this printed model had some hard edges on the sides we had to round off to better match the real thing, and that does make a difference for comfort. And note that while this pistol grip was designed for use with a real AR, it appears to have been patterned off the AEGs that need an A2 grip angle to accommodate a motor. The real thing deliberately mimicked the shallower grip angle of a Colt 1911, but we can't actually find any reproductions that properly replicate it. If we've missed one, or if someone in the community wants to model it themselves, let us know and we'll put it up in a pinned comment. Otherwise, the gun has numerous provisions for sling placement, as all 4 threaded holes on the handguard can accommodate a QD swivel, along with a hole in the stock hinge and a slot on the collapsible stock or either strut of the fixed length. In a lot of ways, this really does feel like an iterative experiment on the AR design. It represents a different path for AR evolution, a road less traveled that preempted the current wave of AR-15-18 hybrids by a full 2 decades. I suspect that had the general public been buying SBRs in the early 2000s, it might have seen more success. As for Airsoft performance, well, it doesn't have much recoil, but it is snappy and efficient. The real star of the show is the work I did to the nozzle and hop-up, and because those upgrades make such a significant difference and are relevant to any VFC AR, we'll be dedicating a whole separate video to them in the future. Still, while this is peak performance for a VFC AR, I don't think I'd call this an ultimate build in the same vein as that Inokatsu M60. It isn't one-to-one externally, and despite all the upgrades, a bone stock VFC AK-74M still kinda puts it to shame. I'm also just kinda getting tired of fielding ARs, and while this one works well and is certainly unique, it is fundamentally another AR at its core. But hey, at least Marksman is making a 633 so I can keep my retro hipster streak going. In all seriousness, we sincerely hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, consider checking out our Patreon or our merch store, both linked in the description. And of course, thank you for watching.